Today on Pilot's Discretion, our guest is professional pilot and safety expert Chris Lutat. He talks about automation airmanship, the role of SOPs, and Coast Guard flying. Pilot's Discretion starts right now. Hello, pilots. I'm John Zimmerman, and thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion from Sporties. Visit sporties.com/podcast for today's show links and access to all 81 episodes of Pilot's Discretion. And remember to leave us a review in your favorite podcast app. Today, my guest is Chris Lutat, one of the leading safety researchers in aviation today, particularly on the topic of advanced technology. He is managing partner at Convergent Performance, a company that provides aviation training and consulting. And he is also the co-author of Automation Airmanship, 9 Principles for Operating Glass Cockpit Aircraft, a book I would highly recommend. But as you might imagine, Chris is on the front lines of these issues as well as a Boeing 777 captain and a former Coast Guard pilot. Chris, welcome to Pilot's Discretion.
Morning, John. Thanks for having me.
You write a lot about automation airmanship. It's the title of your book. What does that mean before we dive into the deep details of it? At a high level, what is automation airmanship and how is that different from traditional concepts of airmanship?
It's a great question, John. I think the explanation really is not any more complicated than the title itself. Our goal has always been to represent traditional airmanship and the value of traditional airmanship in stick and rudder skills, good judgment, decision-making. We play off of Dr. Tony Kern's historical airmanship model as a way to organize the traditional airmanship approach. And then we blend in what research experts and line pilots have been learning for over 40 years in operating glass cockpit aircraft. We think that the best approach is a blend of traditional airmanship with a real sound understanding of aircraft autoflight, how it works, and how the human-machine interaction is exemplified on the modern cockpit.
You mentioned that human part, which is still so critical, obviously, in aviation. You wrote in your book here, after a century of powered flight, aircraft accidents and incidents continue to favor the weakest component in the highly dynamic, tightly coupled system typical of high reliability organizations, the human operators. So why is that human piece so essential, and is that overlooked, do you think, in the modern flight deck?
I think increasingly today it is overlooked, not by individual pilots, of course. I think individual pilots have a really deep sense of how important it is to understand autoflight and to understand their role in managing the autoflight. But I think larger training organizations don't focus on the importance of the human aspect of this. I don't think that most training programs put sufficient emphasis on traditional airmanship. In other words, flying the aircraft without reference to the autoflight, with the autoflight disconnected, whether it's the autopilot, the flight guidance, or speed control, all three together. I think pilots understand that, but major training providers do not.
You mentioned autoflight, which is a concept common in the flight deck for airliners, maybe less common for some of our GA listeners, although piston airplanes are flying with increasingly sophisticated autopilots, no longer just wing levelers. So maybe we're talking about the different levels involved here, where we can have everything from that basic wing leveler or just a flight director where the pilot is still flying, a fully coupled autopilot, and then as you get into more sophisticated airplanes, auto throttle and speed control. Do you view those as it's all part of auto flight, but are those different levels and are there different times for those different approaches?
I think every pilot has to understand what their aircraft is providing to them with relation to the automatic control of the aircraft flight path. These assistants have been in the cockpit for almost 100 years, and whether it's just a wing leveler, a heading bug, or your basic autopilot that keeps you straight and level at altitude, it's essential for pilots to understand the dynamics of that very basic yet assistant to the pilot on the flight deck, all the way up to the most complicated autoflight that's available today. Often I get questions about that center on the most modern aircraft flight deck that is being that are rolling out of completion hangars every year. Yet it's as important to understand this dynamic at the very basic level and very simple aircraft. Yet I think anyone that hangs around general aviation at all appreciates the fact that these aircraft have increasingly capable backup systems, autoflight systems, display systems, guidance systems, and the information flow that is coming into the cockpit. The idea that you can set your Stratus on the glare shield of the aircraft, connect it to your iPad via ForeFlight is an incredible innovation in general aviation, and that must be understood. That interaction between the flight crew, the pilot, and that kind of information has to be understood well before the airplane leaves the chocks.
You talk a lot about when in doubt, fly first, which is tremendously good advice. Some would say common sense, and yet often ignored. Why do you think pilots are so hesitant to turn off the automation when something goes wrong? When you have one of those, the classic joke, what's it doing now? The reaction for many pilots seems to be to try to get the autopilot to do what you want instead of flying the airplane. Why do you think that is? Is that just a natural human tendency, or is that training?
That's a great point. I think it's a combination of both. And I think it's one of the top 3, 4, or 5 safety issues of the day. I think it's important. And in the very near future, we hope we'll all be seeing the ICAO report on manual flying and essentially the several decade statistical loss of manual handling skills or manual flying skills, your basic stick and rudder skills across almost every aircraft type and every kind of aviation operation. I think I have a personal saying that kind of says it all. I've never watched in all my years as an examiner, as a check airman, and as a line pilot. I've never seen any pilot or flight crew win a fist fight with the Autoflight. And what I mean by that is, if you find yourself in what industry safety experts call the UAS, it's not the UAS that acronym that we generally think of. It's UAS in the safety and flying domain generally refers to undesired aircraft state. Most undesired aircraft state, or UASs, generally today in contemporary aviation have an autoflight component to them, have a contribution made by the autoflight. When I say I've never seen a crew win a fist fight with the autoflight, oftentimes when the autoflight has played a role or otherwise participated in the decision process and the airmanship process on the flight deck and getting an aircraft into an undesired aircraft state, the human tendency is to back their way out of that particular situation using the autoflight as well. And I think we've seen that across a number of high-profile accidents and incidents when the best thing to do is to click off the autoflight and maybe even disengage the flight guidance, focus on preserving a safe flight path vector, whether it's attention to the attitude indicator, the standby instruments, or the PFD, and get the airplane stabilized. Once the airplane gets stabilized at a particular attitude and hopefully gets back in compliance with their clearance, now the crew can carefully and deliberately re-engage autoflight if they desire that control. But it gets back to one of my favorite sayings in conversations like this. I've never seen any crew win a fist fight with the autoflight.
Yeah, it's a great point, and it's something I think needs to be stressed more in training, especially in the GA world as we're flying with these more sophisticated autopilots. Something I've tried to add to my annual recurrent training is what I would call unusual attitudes from the autopilot. The traditional unusual attitudes, put your head down, the flight instructor puts it in a spiral. That can be helpful, but increasingly those unusual attitudes happen because of the autopilot. and just practicing that procedure of clicking off the autopilot, taking control, flying basic pitch and power, and getting in a stable condition. Simple thing, but it's good to practice.
Well, I think you're right. And we take it one step further in our, as we were promoting the concept of automation airmanship, you mentioned something that is really key, very subtle and not understood by a lot of pilots, and that's autoflight engagement and disengagement logic. Being able to smoothly engage and disengage the autoflight is a real skill in today's aviation environment. And if you practice it, eventually you become very skilled and very smooth at it. And that concept that we try to explain that goes along with this, that I think is encouraging in this era of modern flight control. I hear this, you hear this, most pilots hear this from their friends and neighbors when they talk about their profession. Oh, you're just really up there pressing buttons. And it doesn't sound very interesting, and it doesn't sound very romantic, if you will, when we think about flight. And it's altogether incorrect, and most pilots will admit that. The concept of unencumbered elegance, the physical interactions with the autoflight, whether it's simply through autopilot engagement and disengagement, or the unencumbered elegance of understanding how all of the autoflight is blended into not just controlling the aircraft in flight, but how the flight crew interacts with it. And that is a real central principle in automation airmanship. That is that it is in fact an elegant expression of airmanship, whether or not you fly the most advanced aircraft in the world or are simply out there in the pattern with a light GA aircraft, controlling it through some basic autoflight qualities.
A concept related to this is one very common in the airline world and the business aviation world. The concept of pilot monitoring and pilot flying. We talk about pilot and command, but this is sort of a slightly different concept. One pilot's flying the aircraft, one pilot's monitoring. Do you think there's some principle there that applies to a single pilot? Can I be the pilot monitoring if the autopilot's on in my Cirrus?
Oh, there's no question about it. And I think we all know that when we're hand flying the aircraft, our aperture, if you will, our focus, our spotlight becomes concentrated on reference to the aircraft attitude, whether that's outside references like the horizon or inside references to the aircraft attitude indicator, flight path symbol. With the autopilot engaged, now we all, I think, when we are good at this, we all understand that gives me the opportunity to open my aperture, open my spotlight to where I can take in other sources of information, process them while the aircraft is being handled in terms of its clearance and its compliance with its designated flight path by the autoflight.
The role of SOPs, I think, plays here. Again, another concept very common in a two-crew environment and in 135, 121 world, less common in the GA world. But I love how you described them. A lot of pilots think about SOPs as just sort of, well, that's the book answer. But you wrote that SOPs are, quote, a written pact between fellow crew members such that none will allow the others to even accidentally violate them. So what do you mean by that? Because I think some pilots would say, well, SOPs are they're standard, but we get to occasionally violate them if, procedures are demanded otherwise. And what you're saying there is that, no, these are not margins to eat into. These are the way we will do it. And even accidentally, you won't let your fellow crew member violate them. So tell me more about the proper role of SOPs.
Yeah, I think you hit on an important topic here. And to put it in other words, it's just simply compliance. We talk about normalization of deviance. We talk about noncompliance. Willful noncompliance is a term often used in the safety domain when we're talking about ASAP programs and focal programs, and those, of course, exist in the 91, 135, and 121 world. But the idea that SOP is the roadmap that you should be sticking to most of the time in operating the aircraft, whether you're operating it for hire or you're just operating it, for your own recreation and business purposes. Violating those, going outside of those boundaries, is something that should cause the hair to stand up on the back of every pilot's neck.
This discussion of automation seems to connect at least a little bit to the debate about artificial intelligence. Now, AI, undeniably the buzzword of the year. I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but it is a real trend. And you had a very interesting article recently in Aviation International News writing about how complex systems fail in complex ways. So, what are some broad principles we should take from automation airmanship and the modern flight deck and how we think about not just AI, but increasingly sophisticated technology? Are there some time-honored lessons that we should keep top of mind here as we think about the evolving role of the pilot?
I think absolutely. I think if you look at all of the notorious accidents, whether they're notorious great saves by the crew or notorious horrible outcomes that the crew played a part in creating, I think it's important to realize that the human component of this is essential. And what we've tried to do is establish a clear pathway, an easier to understand pathway for the human operators to interface with the hardware. We call it how the wetware, the humans or the carbon unit, as sometimes we like to say, interacts with the hardware and the software in the aircraft. It's really important, I think, for humans to understand that they're the most flexible aspect of this system. Every one of these notorious accidents has essentially been highly unique. And AI and large language models are not designed to handle things as humans normally have historically been able to do by exerting their flexibility, their judgment, their ability to innovate essentially on the spot. And when you think of some of these notorious great saves in aviation, it has been because the humans have worked together with not only resources inside the aircraft and inside the cockpit, but with external resources as well to bring the aircraft to a safer outcome than if it had been left to automatic control. And I think that's wildly important. And one other point I'd like to make is in the debate, and I think I represented this in that piece I wrote for AIN, in the debate about whether we should give over this ground that has been traditionally and very well managed by the human component. If we give over that ground to more automated systems, we are asking them to do the things that humans have demonstrated that they're much better at, and we'll give up the concept that some of these one-offs or highly unique situations can be handled by a technology that is largely untested. One of the first things I do every morning when I get to my desk, whether it's opening up my laptop in the field or sitting in my home office, is I look at the safety aggregators messages from the previous day. And a lot of us overnight, we get these messages from the trade publications that show, well, in the last 24 or 48 hours, these things happen. And there's just about no day in my work week where I read through 3, 4, 5, or even more accidents and incidents that happened just yesterday, where the human component of resolving this often very unique one-off situation was really definitive and a real solid predictor of a safe outcome. So I think in the end, most of us will be proven safe in our occupation because the system that we operate in gets more and more complicated every day. Aircraft become more and more useful every day in a variety of different applications. I think it's safe to say that we continue to work on the human component of this. We'll have good results.
We'll link to that piece. It's worth reading, I think, for all of our listeners. I think a line in there sums it up well. It says, probabilistic estimates do not approximate judgment under uncertainty. And many of these new tools are probabilistic estimates. And as you said, so much of what we do in the flight deck is judgment under uncertainty. And that's really what being a great pilot's all about. So, Chris, let's take a quick break. And when we come back, I want to talk about your Coast Guard flying.
Earn all your pilot ratings and keep your flying skills sharp with Sporty's Pilot Training Plus. This all-inclusive membership unlocks Sporty's complete library of award-winning video courses, so you can learn anywhere you have your phone, tablet, or laptop. For one annual fee, you get access to over $1,500 in courses, a smart investment in your flying career. Plus, enjoy free shipping every day of the year at Sporties.com and apply for one of our 3 annual flight training scholarships. Learn more at Sporties.com/pilot training or visit the Sporties tent at AirVenture right in front of Hangar B. Now, back to Pilot's Discretion.
We are back with Chris Lutat, who started his aviation career in the Coast Guard. And Chris, what's a lesson from that part of your career that you've applied to the airline world? Something you learned early on that stuck with you?
Oh, that's a great question. I'll tell you what's different about Coast Guard flying than flying in other organizations. And I think most Coast Guard aviators will agree that within your first, second, or third search and rescue case, and whatever airplane you are flying, whether it's a rotary wing aircraft or big fixed wing airplane, you learn how to be flexible. In the time between you launch the aircraft from a Coast Guard air station and the aircraft arrives overhead of a distress scene, so many things have already changed. The weather conditions on scene, the condition of the crew or passengers on board the vessel, what other resources may be involved, time. There's just so many things that are uncertain, and almost every Coast Guard search and rescue case involving aircraft is different from any other one that you've seen. And one of the first things you realize as a young Coast Guard aviator is how to not just maintain a safe flight path vector for the aircraft close to the water, but also how to remain flexible, work together, not just within your crew, but with all of the other resources on scene and off scene, frankly, to result in a good outcome.
What are some of the big differences between your training or your procedures in Coast Guard flying, say, compared to Air Force or Navy flying? Is it all pretty similar, or is there some piece that's distinctive in the Coast Guard?
Well, I think most Coast Guard aviators come through the Naval Aviation Pipeline in Pensacola, Corpus Christi, and fixed wing pilots go through the Maritime Pipeline. Of course, rotary wing pilots will, for the most part, still go through the Navy rotary wing training programs. So Coast Guard aviators, Marine aviators, and naval aviators share this common naval aviation heritage and this common theme of needing to, by the nature of their respective missions, to be able to independently, in some cases, and in many cases, innovate, plan, coordinate, and do things in a way that relies on smaller organizations and higher headquarters. So I think across all of the sea services, you find the same kind of mindset in their aviation communities.
I know you're doing some mentoring now. You're the assistant coach of the U.S. Coast Guard Academy flight team, flying with students in a Cherokee. I'm sure they are learning a lot from you, but is there anything you have learned from flying with those young people on your end?
Yeah, it's just a great opportunity. At this point in my career, the ability to give back. I live in close proximity to the Coast Guard Academy. We lease a couple of Cherokee 180s from a local FBO, and 8 or 10 weekends a year, we go out and prepare for NIFA collegiate intercollegiate flying events along a pretty narrow set of maneuvering, but it's incredibly challenging for these young and relatively inexperienced student pilot, or not student pilots, but they're certificated private pilots, but these young cadet pilots, I should say, are the eagerness that they have, the almost every time you taxi out, the weather is different from anything they may have ever seen before. And of course, up here in the Northeast, we have, we fly all 4 seasons. So they get to see a lot of different things. And what I particularly like to do is not to impart a lot of my experience with these flyers, but to watch and give them enough rope to make their own decisions so that they can learn from the experience of going through a decision-making process that ends up with a good outcome, and vice versa, a decision process that may end up in a situation that they might not want to put themselves in, and then talking through that. And that to me is a great opportunity to impact the developing airmanship of these young cadet pilots, who most of whom are going to be are part of the future of Coast Guard aviation. So it's very rewarding. There's 4 other assistant coaches that work along with me, and a head coach, of course, is an active duty Coast Guard aviator stationed at the academy. So we've got a lot of Coast Guard experience working with these young men and women, and it's not just a lot of fun; it's very rewarding as well.
That's great advice for any flight instructor, to give the student or give the pilot enough time to learn a little bit on their own, because that's the way that actually sticks. It's not going to be the lecture before they make the mistake. It's going to be remembering the mistake they made. All right, Chris, we always finish Pilot's Discretion with a lightning round called Ready to Copy. I'll ask some questions on a wide range of topics, and you read back your quick answer. Are you ready to copy?
Yeah, let's do it.
What is a habit that demonstrates good automation airmanship?
I think one of the best things that crews can do today is announce when they have engaged or disengaged the autoflight, and also announce any mode changes that they activate or select or are when they fly with another crew member.
That is a great tip that I see all too rarely. When the weather is low, should the autopilot fly or should I hand fly?
Well, I think that depends. Whether or not the autopilot flies, or you connect the autoflight at 500 feet on departure, or you monitor the autoflight while it does an auto landing. Obviously, it depends on a lot of things, but either way, it should be thoroughly briefed. I don't think any crew member that's monitoring a pilot flying should be surprised by a pilot's decision to let the aircraft either auto land or not use the autoflight on departure, when it's clearly one of the most safe things you can be doing. So either way, brief it, and always, if things don't go just the right way, debrief it as well.
What is one change we should make to the typical private pilot curriculum to address glass cockpits and automation better?
I think it's for private pilot training, I think it's important that they know and understand that one of the best things is they can do for themselves in their career, and for their flight departments, if they're going to fly professionally, is to understand the automation and the auto flight logic at a level that is not traditionally trained in training. In other words, go deeper than the training syllabus provides. Seek to learn all that you can about how the aircraft is controlled in automatic flight. That's part one. And part two is never fail to exercise manual control of the flight path at the first suspicion or indication that the autoflight isn't behaving as expected or as planned.
That first one's a great point, because I see students stress out about every detail of the fuel system or the electrical system. And then the autopilot is mentioned in passing in about 3 minutes on the last lesson, right before you go take your check ride, which seems exactly backwards to me. What are the chances we see a single pilot airliner this decade?
0.
So the current Europe talk is all just posturing.
Well, I think it's important to be engaged in the debate, but I think at the end of the day, the folks that are driving the debate are not pilots and crews and leaders in the industry who are engaged at a practical level and see and understand the wide variety of situations that aircraft are in, the increasing complexity of the airspace that grows almost by the day. I think in the end, we'll say there may be some limited roles for that kind of technology, but in an area that is traditionally and always been an inherently human endeavor, that is aviation and manned flight, it should remain just that way.
What is the most important concept in crew resource management? It's a huge topic. You can't possibly summarize it in 5 words, but if you had to pick one piece that a developing pilot should really seek to understand when it comes to CRM, what is it?
I think the notion that any individual pilot knows dramatically less than all of the collective resources he or she has along with them on any given flight, whether it's cabin crew, a fellow crew member, or resources outside the cockpit. The idea that we should all invite and ask for participation of all of these other resources before we execute a decision or decide to control the airplane in a certain way when somebody else on board or outside the airplane might have a better idea.
What's your best advice for a new airline captain? Maybe not a flying tip, but a leadership or a training tip for someone who's newly upgraded.
3 words: ask more questions.
All right, very good. Hope there are upgrading captains in the audience are listening. You've written about 2 authors who taught you a lot about the human-machine relationship, Gary Klein, Henry Petrosky. These are 2 authors I happen to love as well. So I'm curious, what are the best books by those 2 authors if I want to go deeper on these subjects?
Henry Petrosky's written a number of books. You can pick any one of his books. He's an engineering instructor. I believe he's affiliated with Duke University. I would just put Henry Petrosky in your search engine and pick off the title that most resonates with you. In terms of Gary Klein, I think once again, I would do the same thing. I put Gary Klein in your search engine and pick off the title that most suits you. The name of one of the better books I think Klein didn't write directly, but is one of the co-authors of, is Working Minds. It was published, I think, within the last decade or decade and a half, and it talks about cognitive task analysis and how humans go about gathering information in a modern setting, whether it's in aviation or other high-risk, high-reliability industries. Those are both 2 really good titles. But once again, those are 2 really prolific authors in this field, and everybody has a different interest and can pick off of several books that these authors have written.
First time I read Sources of Power by Gary Klein, I was 30 pages in and pilots really hadn't been mentioned yet. And I thought, this guy's got to talk to pilots because he's describing exactly the job we do. And then, of course, he does go on to talk about pilots. So yeah, highly, highly recommended both those authors.
Pretty good stuff.
All right, you were in the Coast Guard for a while, so surely you have some tips for fighting seasickness. If I'm going on a cruise, any secret tips from Coast Guard world I should know about?
Get out in the fresh air and look at the horizon.
All right, Chris, our last question is always the same. You have one final flight. We want to know, what are you flying and where are you going?
Oh, geez. I talk to a lot of business aircraft owners and operators, and I'd just like to take one of those big fancy Gulfstreams halfway across the world and see what that's like to fly at those higher altitudes, that speed, and that beautiful airplane.
Chris, thanks for being on the podcast.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion, brought to you by Sporties, training and equipping pilots worldwide for over 60 years. For more episodes and today's show links, visit sporties.com/podcast. I'm John Zimmerman. We'll see you next time on Pilot's Discretion.